In 1841, along the marsh rivers of coastal Georgia, Lord Alistair Blackwood planned an event that was so wrong that it was erased from history books. They called his land the Elysian Fields, a huge indigo plantation that looked like it had risen from the swamp in a fever dream. But on the day of his wedding, this self-proclaimed king, who thought he could bend the laws of God and nature to his will, would make a deal with his bride for a gift that was not gold or jewels, but living human souls. He would give her 8 of his slaves, a whole family, to take care of without any restrictions. This wasn't just a transfer of property. It was the start of an experiment that would explore the deepest parts of fear, loyalty, and the breaking point of the human spirit in a very scary way. People were supposed to forget what happened in the quiet parts of the Elysian Fields. The Blackwood dynasty was so powerful and influential that it made sure that official records were burned, witnesses were silenced, and the ground itself was salted. But as you will soon see, truth has a way of getting through the cracks of time. The story of Alistair Blackwood and the 8 people he killed to get what he wanted is not a ghost story. It's a sign. It's a map of a darkness that doesn't just live in the past. It also sleeps in the heart of power itself. This isn't just history, it's a seance, a call to a secret that has been waiting nearly 200 years to be told. You need to know the man first in order to understand the craziness that happened. It would be too easy to say that Alistair Blackwood was a brutish, simple master. He was a very smart and scary person who studied the Enlightenment and used its ideas to create a personal gospel of control. He was more than 6 feet tall, had eyes that looked like a winter sky, and moved like a predator. His library had more than just Shakespeare and Plato. It also had books on anatomy, animal husbandry, and rare European writings on psychological compliance. He didn't think of his plantation as a farm. He thought of it as a perfectly tuned machine, with every black or white person on it being a cog that needed to be measured, adjusted, and thrown away if it wasn't working. People knew his ledgers were bad. He didn't just write down how much cotton he made. He kept track of his workers' heart rates after they were punished, how long it took a new mother to get back to work, and how morale changed after a public whipping. He thought of himself as a scientist of humanity, a trailblazer mapping out the wild terrain of the human will. His neighbors, who were also powerful men in Georgia, thought he was an eccentric genius, whose methods were strange but always worked. They were jealous of his success and how well his estate ran, but they stayed away out of respect. Even they could tell that Alistair Blackwood wasn't just going along with the harsh system of their time. He was trying to make it better by getting rid of the messy unpredictability of people and turning it into a cold, pure science of control. And it was this obsession that made him especially open to the woman who would become his wife. Alara Vance was her name, and she came into his life like a beautiful, poisonous orchid. She came from a powerful Charleston family whose wealth came from the horrible things that happened in the slave trade. In every way, she was his equal intellectually and spiritually. Alistair was obsessed with controlling things outside of himself, but Alara was an expert at controlling things inside of herself. She had gone to school in Europe, spoke 4 languages, and had a calm, almost hypnotic beauty. But underneath the silk and pearls was a mind that saw people as complex puzzles that needed to be taken apart and put back together in the way she wanted them to be. She didn't say the usual nice things during their courtship. She didn't want to talk about poetry or parties in the garden. She wanted to walk through the fields with him, but instead of looking at the crops, she looked at the faces of the slaves. She asked him things that no Southern lady would ever think to ask. "Alistair," she'd whisper, her voice a soft caress. "You break the body to make people obey, but what about the soul? What about the things that give them strength, family, faith, love? Are these not things you can't control?" He was completely fascinated. This woman not only understood his ambition, but she also wanted to make it stronger and bring his science of control to its terrifying, logical end. She talked about a new kind of power that didn't need the whip or the shackles. Instead, it rewired a person's very being, making them willingly submit to their own subjugation. She wasn't just going to be his wife. She was going to be his partner and the head researcher in the lab he had built. A whispered rumor from history says that Alara Vance once kept a journal that didn't have daily entries but instead had dissections of human emotion, along with sketches of the facial expressions of slaves she had personally interrogated. No one ever found the journal, if it ever existed. The request came in the middle of a storm. The thunder shook the big windows in Blackwood's study, and the air was thick with the smell of rain and ozone. Alara sat across from him, looking calm but intense, and laid out her plan. She said it was her wedding gift, not a deed to land or a box of jewels. She wanted something much more valuable. She wanted to own 8 specific enslaved people completely and without any ties. She wanted the House of Gideon, not just any 8. The Gideons were a 3-generation family who were known on the plantation for being strong, skilled, and having strong ties. Hezekiah, the patriarch, was a master blacksmith whose hands could fix iron and calm a scared child. His wife Sarah was a weaver who knew a lot about herbal medicine and was a quiet leader. Their 3 sons were Elias, the smart and rebellious one, Jonah, the strong and quiet field hand, and Caleb, the youngest, a musician whose spirit seemed untouchable. And Hannah, Elias's wife, and their 2 young children were with them. 8 people make a perfect, self-contained unit. "They are your strongest," Alara said in a voice that was barely a whisper. "Their bonds are the strongest. If we can break them up, if we can turn father against son and husband against wife, then we will have made a plan for complete psychological control that can be used all over the South." She had already picked the place, a deserted, remote infirmary deep in the cypress swamp, far from any prying eyes. She named it the Loom, because it was where she planned to take apart a family and put it back together in a new way, one that was completely broken and completely hers. Alistair Blackwood, a man who had built an empire on taking smart risks, was faced with a proposal that was both huge and exciting. What Alara was suggesting went way beyond the accepted harshness of their world. It was a step into a moral void. Wives took care of the house staff, cooked dinners, and had children. They didn't do secret psychological experiments on field hands in swamp labs. The legal papers alone would be a nightmare, and they would need to be kept secret in a way that was almost like a conspiracy. But he was fascinated. Her goals were exactly the same as his. He had been trying to get rid of the unpredictable factor of human will from his economic equation for years. He had used physical force, strategic rewards, and constant surveillance, but there was always a ghost in the machine. The strength of the human spirit shone through quiet acts of defiance, shared songs of sorrow, and the stubbornness of family. Alara was giving him the key to get rid of that ghost. She talked about attachment theory, loyalty transference, and how she made a new reality for her subjects where she was the only one who could hurt and comfort them, the only God in their small world. The Vance method, as she called it, would be the most valuable thing they owned if she succeeded. It would be a power greater than land or gold. It would be the power to make people obey at its source. They planned everything over the course of several nights, hunched over maps and legal papers. They chose 2 overseers, men with no ties to the area and a track record of doing soulless work. They also planned the transfer of ownership and changes to the old infirmary. Alistair told himself that this wasn't being mean. It was progress. It was the time to come. Their marriage would not only bring together 2 powerful families, but it would also change the very structure of their society. The wedding day, October 31st, 1841, was a big show. More than 300 people came to the Elysian Fields from as far away as Virginia and Louisiana. Their carriages turned the long avenue of old oaks into a muddy ribbon. The smell of magnolia and roasting pig filled the air, a sensory feast meant to hide the rot at the heart of the plantation. Alistair looked great in his best suit, and Alara looked like a fairy in a dress made of French lace. She moved through the crowds like a picture of Southern grace, her smile never quite reaching her cold, analytical eyes. The ceremony took place at dusk, under a canopy of Spanish moss. 100 flickering torches lit up the scene, casting huge, dancing shadows. But the real show of the day came later, when the groom's gift was given in the traditional way. Alistair Blackwood, a great speaker, stood in front of the South's elite. People of my station are expected to give their brides diamonds, property, and other things that show off their wealth. But my Alara is not a normal woman. She has asked for a gift that is not for herself, but for the betterment of our whole way of life. A wave of curious whispers spread through the crowd. He then made the announcement. He was giving his wife full legal ownership of the 8 Gideon family members so that they could come up with better ways to manage their work. He called it an act of progressive genius, a brave move into the future of farming. He talked about how smart his wife was in business and how much she wanted to help them both do well. He made it sound like a business or an investment. As he spoke, the 8 members of the Gideon family were being led away in chains from the corner of the big lawn. They weren't going to a new home. They were going to the dark swamp. The guests' reactions were a carefully balanced mix of shock and admiration. Most of them were too drunk on champagne and their own importance to understand how bad it really was. They nodded when they heard the words management and efficiency. It was new for a woman to take a more scientific approach in a world where people were seen as property, along with livestock and farm tools. Some of the older, more traditional planters shifted uncomfortably. This was against the rules and the way things were supposed to be. But a lot of the younger, more ambitious men crowded around Alistair and clapped him on the back, eager to learn more about the Vance method. They saw a possible benefit, a new tool in the dark math of their business, but not everyone fell for it. Dr. Ambrose Cole, the county doctor, stood in the shadows of the porch. He was the man who had broken the bones of slaves who had been beaten and delivered their babies. He knew the clinical, detached way Alistair spoke. He could hear the echo of the anatomist's lecture hall and the cold language of the vivisectionist. He saw Alara accept the congratulations of the other women. In her calm smile, he saw a deep and scary emptiness. He was sure, and it scared him to death, that this had nothing to do with managing workers. It was about something much, much worse. He looked out at the swamp, where the overseer's torches were now just tiny dots of light that were lost in the darkness. He thought he had just seen a human sacrifice done in public, and everyone clapped. A quote from Francisco Goya in 1799, "The sleep of reason produces monsters." Goya wrote this on one of his darkest works, a chilling reminder that when logic and intelligence are separated from morality and empathy, they can create horrors that are hard to imagine. That night was the end of the world for the House of Gideon. Moving from the plantation, which was familiar but brutal, to the loom, which was too small and cramped, was like going into a waking nightmare. The old hospital had changed. The windows were boarded up, and the doors were made stronger with iron. It was no longer a place to get better. Alara called the central chamber the observation room. It was a maze of small, windowless cells. This was her theater and her lab. There was a big table, chairs, and a lot of tools that didn't belong on a plantation. Scales, measuring calipers, and strange polished metal tools whose purpose was very unclear. The air was still, and it smelled like damp earth and disinfectant. The silence was absolute, broken only by the drip of water and the distant cry of a night bird from the swamp. They were free of their chains, but it was a joke. They were now more imprisoned than ever before, stuck in a place that didn't follow any known rules or laws. Alara's methods started right away, and they were sneaky. The first rule is to be alone. They put each family member in their own cell. They weren't allowed to talk, sing, or even hum. If someone tried to talk to them, they would be punished, but the punishment would not be given to the person who did it. Instead, it would be given to a random loved one. A son could get his father a day without food by whispering something, and a wife could get her husband a night of standing in ice-cold water by crying. It was the first step in her plan, to use their love against them, to turn what made them strong into what hurt them. The psychological attack was constant and planned. Alara knew that a family is built on a shared reality and a common trust. So, her main goal was to destroy that reality. She would go to each of their cells and speak to them in a calm, hypnotic voice. To Hezekiah, the patriarch, she would say, "Your son, Elias, blames you. He told me he thinks your pride is the reason your family is here. He thinks you should have been more submissive." Then she would go to Elias and say, "Your father is a broken man. He told me he has given up all hope. He wishes you would do the same to make things easier for everyone." All lies, poisonous seeds of doubt carefully planted in the fertile ground of fear and isolation. She messed with their food. Some days, one person would get a lot of food while their child in the next cell would only get water. They could hear the sounds like the plate hitting the table and the painful silence of the hungry. She was teaching them a new gospel. To stay alive, you have to hurt the people you love. They lost track of time. There were no windows, no sun, and no moon, so days and nights bled into each other. The only thing that marked the time was Alara's unpredictable visits. Not getting enough sleep became a way of life. There would be loud, jarring noises at random times, which would keep anyone from getting into deep, restorative sleep. Their minds were tired and frayed, so they were more open to her suggestions. Their dreams were full of paranoia and strange versions of their loved ones' faces. Can you even think of that? To have your mind so carefully unspooled, to start to doubt the people whose love has been your only anchor in a life full of storms. It was a kind of cruelty that was so deep, it was almost an art. As winter came to the Georgia coast, covering the swamp in a constant cold fog, the loom turned into a closed system of despair. Alara kept very detailed notes on her experiment, and her handwriting was a perfect, elegant script. She kept track of their weight loss, how they spoke, how long they were silent, and what they said when they were delirious from lack of sleep. She clinically noted how 9-year-old Samuel started talking to himself and how his mother Hannah developed a nervous tic. She didn't see these as signs of human suffering. She saw them as data points, markers of her progress. She wanted to reach what she called the dissolution, which was the point at which the person's identity as a Gideon was completely erased and replaced with a new identity as subject, a being whose only job was to respond to her stimuli. But she forgot one thing. She forgot about Elias. Elias was the middle son, the one she thought was the smartest and most rebellious. She put all of her energy into him, thinking that if she could break him, the rest would fall apart. She would spend hours with him, having twisted philosophical arguments and trying to break down his faith and sense of self. What she thought was giving up was really just watching. Elias wasn't breaking down in his loneliness or in the middle of her pain. He was making himself into something new. He was looking at her. He learned by heart the sound of her footsteps, the way she spoke, and the guards' daily routines. He started to understand the reasons behind her cruel actions and the patterns in her madness. And in the quietest, deepest part of his soul, a plan began to take shape. It wasn't a plan to get away, it was a plan to judge. On the main plantation, the absence of the Gideon family had left a hole in the community, a wound that was silent and wide open. People had respected and even loved them. Hezekiah's strength, Sarah's healing hands, and Caleb's music were all parts of their shared life. Their sudden disappearance, followed by a cold, threatening silence from the overseers, made them very scared. People were too scared to ask questions out loud, but after the last bell rang, the whispers started in the quiet of the slave quarters. A woman named Seraphina gathered the whispers. She was old and had worked hard all her life, which had bent her back, but her eyes still had a fire in them. As the head cook in the big house, she moved through the world of the masters like a ghost, hearing and seeing everything. She saw that the old infirmary was getting strange packages, medical supplies that weren't normal, chains that were too small for adults, and a lot of lie. She saw the two new overseers who were grumpy and didn't talk to anyone. They smelled like the swamp. Seraphina set up what she called hush meetings in the woods in the middle of the night. They would meet up and pretend to pray, their voices a low rhythmic hum that sounded like cicadas. They put together bits of information, like a field hand who saw lights in the infirmary, a stable boy who heard Alistair talk about the Vance method, and a laundry girl who found a small piece of blood-stained child's clothing near the path to the swamp. They didn't know exactly what was going on in the loom, but they knew it was a sin against God and man. And Seraphina, who had a long memory, started doing something that had never been done before. She made them remember everything, every name, rumor, and date. They were making an oral history, a living record of the crime that would live on even if they all died. Elias found a way to fight back in the loom. It was a language that came from both genius and need. He saw the pipes that ran along the walls connecting each room when the guards would pull them out of their cells for cleaning. That night, he waited until the building was completely silent, and then he tapped out a simple, rhythmic beat with a loose stone from the wall. He tapped out the beat of a song that his dad used to hum while working at the forge. He waited, his heart pounding against his ribs. Then, from the cell where he knew his father was being held, he heard a response. A slow, hesitant echo of the same rhythm. It was a spark in the dark that showed they were still a family, not just people in separate cells. They made a language over the next few weeks. It was a complicated system of taps and scrapes that let them share information, comfort each other, and make plans. Elias would tap out questions like, how many guards? When do they sleep? And, what does she ask you? And the answers would slowly, painfully come back. Alara thought she had successfully broken up her subjects, but this was a complete illusion. She thought she was breaking their ties in the silence, but they were actually making new ones that were stronger than iron and tempered by their shared pain. They weren't just a family anymore, they were a conspiracy. And Elias, the smart but quiet man, had become their leader. Every time he talked to Alara, he was on a mission to get information, and his fake submission was the perfect cover. He was getting to know her thoughts, her weaknesses, and her blind spots. He was waiting for the right time to use her own science against her. A scary picture. Picture a guard walking around by himself in the middle of the night and stopping when he hears a faint rhythmic tapping coming from inside the loom's walls. He thinks it's just rats or the old building settling. He doesn't know that he is hearing a secret conversation that is sealing his own fate and the start of a rebellion. Alara Vance was getting impatient by February 1842. The experiment was not giving her the results she had expected in her writings. The subjects were sad, thin, and mostly unresponsive, but she had not yet completely dissolved their personalities, as she had thought she would. It was getting harder for her to write to other planters who were eagerly waiting to hear how her method worked. She needed to make a big move. She needed to step up. She thought that the last unbreakable bond was the one between a mother and her child. Hannah, Elias's wife, and their 2 kids, Samuel and little Leah, had fought against her methods with a primal stubbornness. She decided that it was time for the last part of the experiment. She told Alistair about her plan during a fancy dinner in the main house. The maternal attachment is the root of all inefficient sentimentality, she said calmly as she cut up her roast duck. We need to cut it off at the source to make the perfect worker. I'm going to tell Hannah that her children have been sold and that she will never see them again. Then I'll give her a choice. She can either help me with my work and get special treatment, or she can waste away in her grief. Alistair, who was very drunk, nodded in agreement. It was brilliant, it was cruel, and it was the move they had been waiting for. Alara woke up the next morning with a new sense of purpose and walked to the loom. She was about to see the end of all her hard work. She was about to break something that couldn't be broken. She didn't know that Elias had already heard about her plan through the humming network of pipes. The Gideon family was no longer waiting to be broken. They were waiting for her. The fight wasn't the bloody, chaotic uprising that people might have thought it would be. It was much scarier than that. It was exact, quiet, and done with the cold logic that she had taught them. When the 2 guards came to get Hannah for the last interview, she was not crying or broken. Elias and his father, Hezekiah, were there to greet them. Elias had told his family to pretend to be weak, save their energy, and watch the guards' every move in the weeks leading up to this. Hezekiah, the blacksmith, had figured out how to use a loose floorboard to slowly and carefully free the hinge pins on his cell door. It was an amazing display of strength and endurance that took place in complete silence over many nights. The guards were used to dealing with weak alone people, so they were completely unprepared for an attack by 2 strong, determined men working together. There were no screams. It was over in seconds. Their captors were quickly and quietly taken out. The Gideons then went through the loom, not like prisoners trying to get away, but like angels coming to get them. They let the others go, and their movements were smooth and practiced. There was no time for emotions at the reunion. It was quiet and tearless. The only thing that mattered was the mission. They all met in the observation room, which was Alara's own cruel theater. They stood still. They heard her footsteps coming closer as the sun reached its highest point, the light, confident click of her boots on the wooden walkway. The person who made them miserable was coming home. Alara Vance did not scream when she walked into the observation room. She was too smart and too calm to show such a thing. She stopped and looked at the impossible scene. The 2 dead guards lying neatly in a corner, and the 8 members of the Gideon family standing together, not as scared subjects but as a court. They were thin and pale from not getting any sun for months, but their eyes burned with a cold, righteous fire. Hezekiah was in the middle, a powerful, patriarchal figure, but Elias stepped forward and locked eyes with her. He said, "Mistress Vance," and the word was like a knife. "Your experiment is over. Now, ours begins." What happened next was not a physical attack. It was a breakdown of the mind. For the next few hours, Elias and the Gideons used Alara's own methods against her. They cut her off from everyone else not by putting her in a cell, but by what they said. Every member of the family came forward and told their story, describing in painful detail every lie she had told them, every punishment she had given them, and every piece of their humanity she had tried to take away. They used her own clinical language and her own ideas about how to break up and transfer loyalty. They held up a perfect, unflinching mirror to her soul and made her look. They never touched her. They didn't need to. With the tools she had given them, they were taking apart her mind, piece by piece. The woman who thought she was a god and saw other people as puzzles to be solved was now the subject. And she was learning that the human spirit doesn't always break when it is pushed to the very edge. It can sometimes turn into a weapon of terrible, perfect clarity. Alistair Blackwood became worried as the sun went down, turning the swamp purple and blood orange. Alara had not come back for dinner. It was against the rules that kept their lives running like clockwork. He took a lantern and a gun and went to the loom, feeling a knot of worry in his stomach. The silence that greeted him was deep. The usual sounds of the swamp seemed to be muted, as if the land itself were holding its breath. He saw that the door to the infirmary was open when he got there. He pushed it open and the light from his lantern cut through the darkness. The world as he knew it came to a permanent, screeching stop. The inside scene was a work of art in the art of methodical horror. Yes, the 2 guards were dead, but his wife was sitting in the middle of the room in the chair where she had been watching. She was not hurt physically, but she was not there. Her eyes were wide open, and she was staring at something outside of the room and the world itself. She was in a catatonic state, her mind broken into a million pieces that could never be fixed. The Gideons were gone. Gone. They hadn't gone on a rampage through the building, breaking things out of anger. They had instead left everything in perfect order. They had left a present for Alara on the table in front of him. She had written in her own journal, which was full of careful notes, but on the last page, in a clear, strong hand that he didn't know, there was a new entry. It was a detailed look at her mental breakdown, written in her own clinical style, and it showed how she was falling apart. The last sentence said, "Subject has reached a state of total compliance. Experiment complete." Alistair Blackwood's first thought wasn't sadness or fear, it was how to fix things. His mind, which was like a cold, calculating machine, started to figure out how dangerous the threat was right away. No one could find out about this. The scandal would not only ruin him, but it would also show the dark side of their whole society, the planter elite's hidden goals and shared cruelty. His most trusted men were at the loom within an hour. A doctor, who had sworn to keep Alara's secret, moved her quietly to a private upstairs room in the main house, where she would live out the rest of her days as a beautiful, breathing ghost. Alistair buried the guards' bodies deep in the swamp and then set fire to the loom. He stood and watched as the flames destroyed the proof of his and Alara's arrogance. The orange glow shone in his cold, winter sky eyes. He thought he was closing the wound and getting rid of the mistake. He sent carefully worded letters to his allies, the other powerful families who knew about the experiment, through writers. There was a tragic fire and a loss of property, according to the official story. The fire had killed the 8 slaves. A lie that is simple and clean. But Alistair Blackwood had no way of knowing that the Gideons' plan was never just about keeping themselves alive. Elias had made sure of that. They left a second trail, made of paper, before they went into the swamp. Charles de Montesquieu said in 1748, "There is no crueler tyranny than that which is perpetuated under the shield of law and in the name of justice." An 18th century truth that showed how Alistair's world worked, turning deep evil into a system that was okay and even respectable. 2 months later, The Liberator, a well-known abolitionist newspaper in Boston, got a package. There was no return address on it. There was a stack of papers inside with beautiful, feminine writing on them. It was a copy of Vance's journal, but not all of it. The most damning parts were the first proposal for the experiment, the clinical descriptions of her methods, and her letters to other planters talking about their plans to use the Vance method on their own plantations. There was a second document that came with the journal. It was written in a different, stronger hand. It was a letter from a man who only signed it Gideon. It was a calm, clear, and devastatingly accurate account of what had happened in the loom. It didn't sound like the desperate plea of a runaway slave. It sounded like the opening statement of a prosecutor. At first, the newspaper didn't believe it, But then it started to look into it. The names in the journal were real, the plantations were real, and the rumors of a terrible fire at the Blackwood estate fit perfectly with the timeline. In the spring of 1842, they put out their first article. There was an explosion. The story, with its Gothic horror and educated, civilized villains, was a stronger argument against slavery than any abstract argument. It gave the bad a face, a name, and a way of doing things. The Blackwood atrocity, as it was called, became a rallying cry for the movement to end slavery. People copied the journal and passed it around. It was read aloud at town hall meetings and in church pulpits all over the North. Alistair Blackwood's end had begun. The fallout in the South was quick and violent. The men who had been so excited to see the results of Alistair's experiment turned on him like animals that were trapped. They had to kill him to save themselves. He was publicly shamed, his name was taken off of social lists, and his business partnerships were ended overnight. He became a pariah, a living example of the worst things the North said about Southern planters. At the same time, all of his creditors, who had once begged him for business, called in all of his loans. The price of his indigo dropped for no apparent reason. Lost shipments. Overseers either quit or openly rebelled when they saw the power shift. The clockwork machine in the Elysian fields started to slow down. Alistair was stuck in his big house with his ghost wife, and the empire around him was falling apart. While this was going on, the other planters started a frantic and paranoid search for the leak's source. They couldn't believe that escaped slaves could have planned such a complicated attack. They thought there was a white traitor, a rival, or an abolitionist spy among them. The fear that grew was much worse than the fear of a slave revolt. They were afraid that their secrets were no longer safe, that their control system was falling apart, and that something smart, organized, and hidden was now working against them from the shadows. They had every reason to be scared. The Gideons weren't just free, they were busy. What happened to the Gideon family? They didn't run away to the north. That would have been too easy and too obvious. With Elias's help, they had melted into the Great Dismal Swamp, a huge, wild area that had long been a safe haven for groups of people on the run. But they weren't just hiding, they were building. Elias knew that their story was a weapon, but one story wasn't enough. He had to build a network. They started to connect with other maroon communities, free blacks who were sympathetic to their cause, and even some white traders who were unhappy with the way things were going. They did this by using contacts that Sarah had quietly built up over the years because she knew about healing and trade routes. They set up a complex network of spies. Slaves who had been alone on their own plantations started to talk to each other about things like their master's money problems, the weaknesses of overseers, and the patrol schedules of slave catchers. People didn't call it that, but the Gideon network became a quiet, hidden force that hurt the plantation economy from the inside. The planters in coastal Georgia and the Carolinas started to have a lot of strange, planned events happen to them. A fire would destroy an important mill on one plantation, and on the same night, 50 miles away, the best horses on another plantation would mysteriously go lame. It was quiet, hard to deny, but it never stopped. It was a new kind of war, a war of 1,000 small cuts, planned by a brilliant strategist who had been forged in the fires of the loom and now lived in the swamp. Alistair Blackwood was a prisoner in his own home for the last year of his life, watching everything fall apart. Once a model of efficiency, the Elysian fields became a deserted wasteland. The weeds were choking the fields, and the big house was falling apart. He wasn't haunted by the ghosts of the Gideons. He was haunted by his own ambition. He could now see clearly that he had let loose a force he couldn't understand in his attempt to control the human spirit. His study of control had been a waste of time. He had treated people like parts of a machine, not realizing that when you put too much pressure on a part, it doesn't just break. It can change its very nature, becoming something harder, sharper, and much more dangerous. His last act was to confess, not to a priest or a judge, but to paper. He locked himself in his study for a week and wrote down everything with a shaking hand. The whole story, the deal with Alara, the loom's details, the cover-up, and the other planters' conspiracy. He didn't spare anyone, not even himself. It wasn't an act of repentance. It was his last, angry act of revenge against the men who had left him. He wanted to bring the whole rotten temple down on their heads. He told them everything he knew about the Gideon network, calling it a cancer in the heart of our society, an enemy that was not only smart, but also seemed to be everywhere at once. And on the last pages, he told the one thing he had kept from everyone, the truth about what the Gideons did to Alara before they left her. Alistair's confession, which was found years later hidden in a wall of the crumbling mansion, says that the Gideons did more than just break his wife's mind. They had a ceremony after they had broken her mind. They took her to the middle of the room and talked to her one at a time. But they weren't talking to Alara Vance, the woman. They were talking to the spirit of cruelty that she was. They told her that her science was wrong, that her power was fake, and that the ties she had tried to break were now the chains that would keep her soul there forever. They didn't kill her body. Instead, they thought they had sent her spirit to hell. They left her as a living monument to her own failure, a silent, screaming testament to how strong the human soul is. Alistair wrote, the first and only word she spoke to him before lapsing into a permanent, unbreakable silence was a name, Gideon. His confession ended with a haunting passage. I sought to be a god on my own land, he wrote. I tried to design the human soul. Instead, I made my own devil, Elias Gideon. He didn't escape from my prison. He was born in it. And now his shadow falls over us all. Alistair Blackwood walked down to the river that ran along the edge of his property shortly after he finished his confession. This was the same river that had once carried his indigo to market, and he was never seen again. People used to talk about his dynasty with fear and awe, but now it was just a whisper of a dark and terrible story. The Blackwood atrocity left behind a long and complicated legacy. When Alistair's confession was finally found, it shocked the Southern elite and led to a series of secret trials and quiet exiles that changed the balance of power for a generation. People never talked about the Vance method again. It was buried as a piece of forbidden knowledge, a path that was too dangerous to walk again. The state took the Elysian fields and sold them off in pieces. The big house was left to rot, and it became a haunted monument that kids dared each other to go near. The Gideons, on the other hand, had the real legacy. Their network kept growing and became an important part of the Underground Railroad. Their ways of gathering information and working together to sabotage things are getting better and better. Elias Gideon, whose name was never written down in history books, became a legend in the secret world of the Resistance. He was known only as the Weaver, because he could weave together different threads of rebellion into a single story. They never saw him again. He and the rest of his family vanished from history, turning into something more like a myth. Did they finally get to the north? Did they spend the rest of their lives free in the swamps? No one knows for sure. But what they did changed things forever and left a permanent mark on the minds of the slaveholding class. They had shown that the slaves were more than just victims. They were also more than just property. They could be strategists or warriors, and if they were pushed too far, they could use the master's tools against him with terrifying accuracy. This case wasn't just about one landowner or family. It showed how scary it is that power can make people act in ways that are bad. the belief that a small group of people should control, engineer, and improve humanity. Alistair and Alara thought of themselves as visionaries and pioneers who were pushing the limits of what was possible. They weren't just greedy, they had a much more dangerous idea, that they had the right, even the duty, to change other people for a purpose they alone defined. This darkness has echoed through history, from the eugenics programs of the 20th century to today's fears of social engineering and technological surveillance. Wanting to make a perfect, predictable, and obedient person is a nightmare that keeps coming back. The story of the loom is a stark reminder that the worst things happen when things are planned, organized, and thought out. They start with the idea that some people are tools and others are the ones who use them. But was Alistair's confession the whole truth, or was it the last desperate act of a broken man trying to make a story out of his own failure? Is the real story of the Gideon Network and all of its effects still hidden away in a history that we aren't supposed to read? What do you think really happened to the Gideon House? Leave a comment below and sign up to get more truths that have been purposely forgotten. If you've gotten this far, you're not just watching this, you're becoming part of its telling. This is because some of history's most important secrets are not buried in the past. They are living codes that we need to figure out.